Late October. The boundary waters had fallen completely silent. Summer was over, and the wilderness was finally alone. With every camper gone, only one ranger remained at the old Fall Lake station, finishing the final paperwork before winter. Then he opened a forgotten file, a permit that should have never existed. The radiator in the corner of the vault room didn't hiss so much as it planked, a heavy rhythmic shudder signaling another winter drawdown at the Fall Lake Ranger Station. Late October brought a predictable, stark quiet to the boundary waters. The summer canoeists were long gone, and the seasonal techs had already laid off after 5 months of routing 3-ply permits and digging out remote wilderness latrines. Down in the limestone basement, the air tasted cold, damp foundation concrete, floor wax, and the dry, vinegary tang of decomposing paper. Tonight's assignment was manual reconciliation. The regional mainframe in Duluth had thrown 3,000 data exception flags during the annual cloud migration, mostly prehistoric files from the mid-1980s that the optical scanners couldn't parse due to fading ink or folded margins. 18 years with the Forest Service breeds a specific preference for the quiet shift. It beats arguing with tourists from Minneapolis about why they can't haul copper-jacketed ammunition or aerosol cans into a primitive zone. Slid beneath a single 80-watt bulb, the green legal size hanging folder was labeled 1986, fiscal third quarter, unfiled. The texture of the sheets gave them away immediately. The old 3-ply carbon stock the Department of the Interior favored before regional offices decentralized. Thick, slightly fibrous, with that oily carbon residue that leaves a faint gray smudge on your skin if you handle it too long. A yellow middle slip came loose near the center of the stack. Permit number 314. Registered to a family of 3 named Miller, out of Eau Claire, Wisconsin. Entry point, Saginaga Lake, heading west into the border corridor on August 14, 1986. My glasses needed an adjustment. Leaning down into the field of the desk lamp, my eyes ran over the itinerary columns to check the compliance codes out of pure institutional habit. Then the pen stopped. The clearance notes, typed by whatever long-dead seasonal clerk had worked the counter that morning, contained an impossible instruction in the safety directive box. Right there in the tiny lined grid reserved for minimum impact fire regulations, the clerk had used an old manual ribbon typewriter to punch in a specific operational command. Upon departure from Saginaga Corridor, overnight coordinates. The registrant must leave the primary ignition ring saturated but uncleared. Do not scrape stones to mineral soil. Leave the internal ash bed wet. The pit must remain filled. The purple ink of the typed text made no sense. It was an egregious breach of the most basic wilderness protocols on the books. Ever since the Wilderness Act of 1964, the absolute baseline of backcountry fire management has been the cold out rule. You drown the fire, you shovel the coals, and you scrape the interior granite down to bare earth, so no subterranean root fires can smolder through the peat over winter. Explicitly commanding a civilian party to leave a pit choked with wet ash was an invitation to a subsurface peat fire. Yet the form bore the official 3-inch circular validation mark of the USFS district office. It had passed through the audit chain without a single red ink notation or supervisory flag. A quick turn of the dial on the high-intensity drafting lamp tilted the silver shade, casting white halogen light across the yellowed carbon sheet at a sharp angle. The paper was clean. No water damage, no modern adhesive trails, none of the typical signs of a practical joke. The adjacent legal boxes for the surrounding years were stacked in the steel racking behind my chair. If a clerk had gone rogue in the mid-80s, a pattern would show up in the subsequent fiscal records. Dragging the 1996 and 2080s archives onto the oak desk caused the dry cardboard corners to split as they forced open. Flipping through the folders led straight to the numerical sequence for the third quarter. In both boxes, sitting precisely between the entries for permit number 313 and permit number 315, was permit number 314. The 1996 copy, was a pink receipt-style voucher issued to a lone kayaker from the south side of Chicago named Thomas Crane. The 2008 document was a modern thermal printout, its edges curling inward, registered to a couple from Duluth named Gorse. Arranging the 3 permits chronologically on the desk blotter, I lifted them together toward the fluorescent tubes overhead to check for variations in the printing houses or the regulatory text on the back. Instead, my eyes locked onto the left-hand margins. The physical layout of the 3 documents matched down to the single millimeter. On the 1986 carbon copy, the letter S in Saganaga was slightly dropped, its upper loop clipped by a misaligned plate on the printing press. On the 1996 pink voucher and the 2008 thermal sheet, the exact same dropped S occurred in the exact same spatial coordinate. Worse, the handwritten margins, the lines where 3 distinct travelers had supposedly signed their names across 3 decades, carried the exact same mechanical ink indentations. Running a thumb along the back of the 2008 thermal paper revealed the deep, heavy impression of a ballpoint pen tip that had been pressed into the 1086 carbon paper 22 years prior. 3 different signatures, written across 3 decades, had left a single, unified physical indentation that cut through the history of the filing cabinet like a needle through cloth. A cold draft swept across the floorboards, carrying the scent of frost from the lake outside. The papers went back onto the blotter. The skin on my hands felt dry, tight from the drop in temperature. Terminal Station 2 was the old, ruggedized IBM box we kept hooked up to the state's legacy database network. I walked over and booted it, needing to verify the registration history. In 18 years of service, I'd seen seasonal staff pull some complex pranks during the slow winter months, forging old logbooks, printing dummy receipts on retired equipment, slipping fake files into the archives to confuse the next auditor. It was an annoying institutional tradition. The green phosphorus screen flickered as the DOS-based terminal linked with the law enforcement and search and rescue databases in St. Paul. I typed in the names from the 3 permits: Miller 1986, Crane 1996, and Gorse 2008. Standard operating procedure for a wilderness area is absolute. If a group doesn't return their physical permit tag to the designated drop box within 48 hours of their listed exit date, their vehicle at the launch trailhead is flagged for an abandonment check. If the truck is still there, the county sheriff is notified, the SAR log is opened, and a tow company out of Ely clears the vehicle to the regional impound lot. The queries for all 3 names went through the vehicle history and towing registries. The screen blinked twice, its green cursor ticking in the dark. Query returned 0 results. No towing records, no missing persons reports. No abandoned vehicle citations at the Saganaga launch or the Moose Lake landing. But when I went back to the physical boxes and searched for the corresponding checkout stubs, the tiny white cards that field rangers clip from the permits when a party safely exits the bush, the slots were empty. The system had no record of these people ever leaving the water, yet the outside world had never registered their vehicles as left behind. It was as if the administrative network had actively smoothed over their disappearance, rewriting the external registration logs to ensure that no flags would ever be raised in the civilian world outside the boundary markers. A heavy, rhythmic thud rattled the glass of the rear mudroom door upstairs, followed by the dry metallic scrape of the exterior mail drop being cleared. The morning patrol packet had arrived early from the field boxes. Leaving the terminal running, I climbed the short flight of wooden stairs to the ground floor. The air in the main hallway was significantly colder than the basement, sharp with the smell of the pine forest that began less than 20 yards from our rear siding. The back door was shut, its brass latch locked, but the floor was wet with a trail of melted sleet that had blown in through the mail slot. On the unlit stainless steel sorting table sat the weather-sealed canvas drop packet. It was dusted with a thin crust of white hoarfrost that was already turning to gray slime under the warmth of the hallway ceiling vents. The field ranger on the night run must have dropped it and gone straight to the maintenance depot down the road. There were no truck tires visible in the turning loop through the trees, only the dark, wet asphalt of the driveway reflecting the gray sky. Unzipping the bag with fingers clumsy from the cold, I dumped the contents onto the steel table. A dozen modern, clear plastic day-use vouchers slid out, accompanied by 2 overnight permits printed on the new blue synthetic Ride in the Rain stock we introduced 5 years ago. Then, a single sheet of yellow paper slid out from the center of the bundle. It was the oily, heavy carbon stock of permit number 314. The edges were crisp, entirely free of the dust and dry rot that characterized the files downstairs, but the layout was identical to the 1986 slip under my desk lamp. Turning it over, the validation date stamped into the lower right corner read for the current week, October 2026. The adrenaline hit me in the center of my chest, a sharp metallic taste rising in the back of my throat. My professional distance vanished. This wasn't an archival mystery anymore. It wasn't a 20-year-old prank pulled by a retired district ranger. The loop had broken through the filing cabinets and was sitting on my sorting table, wet with today's rain. Scooping up the entire pile of paper, leaving the canvas bag on the floor, I carried it back down into the basement vault. I sat under the halogen light, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps that looked like white puffs in the cold room. I pulled my heavy desk magnifier down until the glass lens was 2 inches above the fresh 2026 document. The paper was identical in weight and fiber structure to the obsolete 1986 Department of the Interior stock, paper that hadn't been manufactured since the mills in International Falls changed their chemical bleaching processes in 1991. I reached out and rubbed my bare thumb over the official validation mark in the corner. The ink was a dark, dull matte purple. It didn't smear like modern dye-based inks. It left a thick, greasy residue on my skin that carried a sharp chemical odor, the distinct, pungent smell of methyl violet and carbon tetrachloride. I knew that smell. I opened my lower desk drawer, rummaging through the old policy binders until I found a faded internal circular from May 1988. The document was an agency-wide safety directive ordering the immediate destruction of all purple ink validation pads due to new federal toxicity standards regarding chemical exposure for desk staff. The ink on the 2026 slip wasn't a replica. It was fresh, wet, and chemically identical to a batch of contraband material that had been buried in a hazardous waste landfill before the current seasonal staff were even born. My hand was trembling as I reached for the keyboard of Terminal Station 2. The physical facts were failing me. The paper had mass, it had weight. It had a distinct smell that was currently filling the tight confines of the basement room. Bypassing the main network login, I forced the system into the active Minnesota Department of Public Safety driver's license registry. The registrant listed on the fresh 2026 carbon copy was a solo kayaker named Donald Gorse, with an address listed on a rural route outside of Grand Marais. I typed the name into the query field, along with the 7-digit alphanumeric license number written on the permit form. I hit the enter key. The IBM terminal didn't return a standard record. The internal cooling fan inside the metal chassis began to scream, a high mechanical whine that rose in pitch until the metal casing vibrated against the desk. The green phosphor screen blinked 4 times, the text line shrinking into a single, brilliant horizontal white line across the center of the glass. Then the monitor turned a solid, deep blue. Raw system architecture code began to scroll downward in jagged, broken columns, replacing the user interface with an internal memory dump. Error 0994, record archived via pre-digital attrition. Current status, closed entry. The keyboard went entirely dead. I pressed the escape key, then the system reset sequence, but the blue screen remained frozen, the cursor trapped in the center of the architecture code. The system had locked me out, refusing to acknowledge the existence of Donald Gorse outside of the specific paper slip that had just come through the rear door. I left the terminal screaming its high-pitched fan noise into the corner and walked over to the mapping center on the far side of the vault. A 6-foot laminated topographical wall map of the Saginaw corridor hung from a cedar frame, its surface detailed with every reef, campsite icon, and portage trail between the US border and the Canadian interior. I held the wet 2026 permit in my left hand, using my right index finger to trace Gorse's listed itinerary coordinates across the plastic lamination of the map. Night 1, Swamp Lake. Night 2, Otter Track. Night 3, Island Campsite 44, southern arm of Knife Lake. My finger stopped over the grid intersection for Knife Lake. There was no campsite icon at those coordinates. Island 44 had been completely removed from the master management plan in the spring of 1992. I had been a seasonal trainee when the incident report came through. A historic July microburst had come over the ridge from Ontario, flattening every white pine on that specific 3-acre rock and dropping the root systems directly into the water. The island had been legally closed, its campsite designation retired, and its coordinates deleted from every public map printed in the last 34 years because of the extreme hazard of falling deadfalls. The permit was commanding Donald Gorse to pitch his tent on a submerged rock pile that hadn't held a legal fire ring since the Bush administration. A cold knot of intellectual stubbornness hardened in my chest. 18 years of perfect cartographic comprehension don't allow for errors of this scale. The map is the territory, the rules are the rules. If the coordinates were wrong, it meant the permit was an invalid document, and an invalid document meant there was an active, unregistered body on the water that I had to legally clear before the lakes froze over. I sat down at the digital GIS mapping console next to the wall map. This terminal was a modern Dell unit, hooked up to the county's advanced satellite mapping software. I moved the mouse, woke the system, and opened the active terrain editor. I intended to force an administrative correction on the Knife Lake sector, to enter a hard-coded warning flag that would bounce Gorse's permit out of the active reservation queue. I typed in the exact longitudinal and latitudinal coordinates for the retired Island 44 site. I pressed the entry key. The monitor didn't display a red redaction banner. Instead, the pixels across the center of the map view began to ripple, a slow, wave-like distortion that looked like heat haze rising off asphalt. The clean, established vector lines that defined the southern shoreline of Knife Lake began to pull away from each other on the screen, bending and elongating in real time. Right before my eyes, the software began to draw a brand new, deep, unmapped bay into the solid granite of the Canadian Shield. The contour lines rearranged themselves into a steep, narrow ravine that split the ridge, carving out an entirely new body of water where 40 feet of prehistoric rock had sat since the glaciers retreated. The system wasn't rejecting the error, it was rewriting the physical shape of the state of Minnesota to accommodate the typo on the yellow carbon slip. My breath caught in my chest. The room felt suddenly very large, very dark, and entirely empty. I stood up from the console, my legs shaking slightly, and walked back to the oak desk where the 1986, 1996, and 2008 copies of permit number 314 sat under the halogen lamp. I needed to look closer. I pulled my grandfather's old brass linen tester out of my breast pocket, unfolded the small magnifying lens, and placed it directly over the tiny cursive script scrawled beneath the official signature lines at the bottom of the 1986 document. It was a tiny postscript, written in a cramped, hurried hand that looked like it had been added after the form was verified by the clerk. The fire pit remains wet. The ash cannot dry. I shifted the magnifier to the 1996 pink voucher. The same line was there. I moved it to the 2008 thermal sheet. The same line. I stared at the letters through the lens, focusing on the specific, irregular abbreviation of the letter T, the way the crossbar didn't touch the vertical stem, but floated slightly to the left, terminated by a sharp downward hook. I looked at the letter Y in the word dry. Its tail was unusually long, looping backward into a double underlined flourish that cut through the line below it. My chest went completely tight, the air escaping my lungs in a short, sharp hiss. It was my handwriting. It wasn't a style that looked like mine. It was my exact personal shorthand. a highly specific, cramped typographic habit that I had only developed 3 years ago, during the long winter months following my divorce, when I started using old green-bound ledger books to log my field evaluation cards because my hands were too stiff to type for long periods. I was looking at my own physical signature, written with my own distinct muscle memory, resting on a piece of yellow carbon paper that had been filed away in a steel drawer when I was still a senior at Eli School. The barrier between what had happened and what was happening went entirely soft, dissolving like paper in a wet swamp. I stood up and walked out onto the exterior observation deck to get away from the sound of the terminal fan. The storm had arrived with an unnatural, silent speed. The wind was screaming through the tops of the black spruce behind the station, but the sound was thin, high, and hollow, like the noise made by blowing across the top of an empty bottle. Freezing rain was falling in steady, heavy sheets, dropping the temperature on the deck below the freezing mark in a matter of minutes. The wooden railings of the observation platform were already encased in a thick, clear glaze of ice that reflected the dull gray light of the horizon. I shined my heavy-duty field flashlight out toward the Fall Lake launch ramp, but the beam died less than 10 feet from the deck, swallowed by a wall of pitch-black, suffocating fog that seemed to absorb the light rather than scatter it. The air smelled intensely of ozone, frozen moss, and something else, something heavy and sweet that smelled like old chimney soot after a summer rain. The wilderness didn't feel like a space anymore. It felt like a circuit that was slowly closing its gates, lowering its temperatures and drawing its boundaries inward, until the ranger station itself was the only thing left outside the line. The season was ending tonight, and the system was running out of time to resolve the open file under my lamp. I moved back inside, slamming the heavy timber door against the sleet, and rushed to the main counter to grab the microphone of the heavy base station radio. I needed to call the Superior National Forest headquarters in Duluth to get a supervisor on the line, to report a spatial emergency, to find any human voice that could provide a baseline reality check before the power failed. As my fingers touched the plastic housing of the microphone, the office lights flickered twice and died. The hum of the basement radiator cut out instantly, leaving the building in a deep, absolute silence that was broken only by the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the freezing rain hitting the window panes like thrown gravel. I flipped the emergency backup toggle on the radio console. The screen remained dark. The little red indicator light that showed battery voltage didn't blink. I had personally inspected the auxiliary gel cell batteries 48 hours ago during the monthly compliance audit. They were brand new, sealed, and bolted into a concrete well beneath the floor. Now, they were completely cold, drained of every volt of potential, as if the wires had been cut from the inside. The station had been decoupled from the grid. The outside world wasn't reachable because, according to the logic of the system, there was no longer an outside world to receive the data. I walked back down into the basement vault, my flashlight beam cutting a clean white circle through the dark. I needed to ground myself. I unlocked my personal desk drawer and pulled out my 2023 field journals, the green canvas-bound notebooks where I had spent those long, empty nights tracking timber maintenance schedules along the Kawashiwi district. I laid the 2023 notebook side by side with the 1986 permit postscript on the desk blotter, holding both under the white beam of my flashlight. The line weight was identical. The hurried slant was identical. The microscopic tremor on the letters, a small twitch in my index finger that only showed up after I broke my wrist on a winter portage 4 years ago, was clearly visible on the paper from 1986. It was an impossible, physical match. The rigid barrier I had built between my past, my present, and the protocol of my job was gone. The administrative record hadn't copied my handwriting. It had simply waited 40 years for me to grow into the shape of the hand that had already signed the page. Then, a deep, heavy thud-thud-thud echoed through the log framework of the building. It didn't come from the roof or the floorboards. It was vibrating through the heavy cedar timbering of the walls themselves, a wet, dragging sound accompanied by the sharp, rhythmic clack of stone hitting wood. It sounded exactly like a heavy Kevlar canoe hull being dragged across a rocky, low-water portage trail by someone who was moving with immense physical effort. The sound tracked directly above my head, moving from the eastern wall of the basement vault toward the western storage racks. I could hear the wet, heavy squelch of leather boots pressing into deep mud, followed by the metallic rattle of aluminum gunwales scraping against branches. The outdoor wilderness wasn't outside anymore. It was orally intruding into the sealed infrastructure of my office, turning the dry space of the filing vault into an active trail. I stood frozen in the center of the room, my flashlight beam shaking so badly that the circle of light bounced wildly across the rows of green folders. Across the room, the dead screen of Terminal Station 2 suddenly flashed back to life. The monitor didn't boot through the standard BIOS. A single high-contrast law enforcement citation banner popped up on the blue background, dated 2 minutes ago. Location field, Knife Lake, Primitive Sector, Closed Island 44. Violation description: unlawful maintenance of a saturated ignition site. Campers left fire pit wet. Issuing officer: Cordell, V, badge number 414. The text line blinked 3 times, then fell silent. The issuing officer's name was mine. The badge number was mine. The system was framing me for an infraction that was currently taking place 30 miles away in the interior bush, generating the paperwork for my departure before I had even reached for my keys. I turned and ran up the stairs, my boots hitting the steps in a frantic, claustrophobic rush to escape the basement. I reached the rear viewing windows that overlooked the Fall Lake boat launch, intending to look for any headlights or emergency vehicles on the entry road. I pressed my face against the triple-paned glass, but my flashlight beam died instantly against the exterior surface. The freezing rain outside had changed. The slush sliding down the window pane was no longer clear water. It was a thick, dark gray slurry that looked like wet soot. I pulled my hand back from the glass. My palm was covered in a fine, powdery gray residue that had bled straight through the solid lamination of the window pane onto the inside of the room. The air in the hallway was suddenly dry, hot, and thick with the bitter, alkaline scent of wet wood ash and stagnant bog water. The office was no longer an observation post. It was being converted into the anomaly's terminus, the final destination of the permit loop. I broke away from the windows and bolted back into the filing vault, my mind turning to the only historic record that might contain an answer: the original 1992 microburst incident report. I needed to know exactly how Island 44 had been destroyed, if anyone had been on the rock when the trees came down, or if the Forest Service had used the storm as an excuse to clear something else out of the registry. I pulled the heavy steel drawer marked 1992, Weather Casualty. My hands were gray now, covered in a soot that was beginning to seep through the ventilation ducts. I flipped through the green hanging folders until my fingers hit the tab for the Knife Lake incident. I hauled the folder out and opened it flat on the floor. The pages inside were entirely blank. The official federal forms, the incident log sheets, the witness statements, the hazard assessments were completely smooth, devoid of a single line of typed text or signature. The only thing inside the folder was a single, triangular piece of charred granite stone that sat in the center of the white paper like a weight. When I touched it, the stone left a wet purple streak of soot across the clean file interior, the exact shade of the banned 1988 methyl violet ink. The system permanence hadn't recorded the microburst to preserve history. It had used the storm as a bureaucratic deletion mechanism to hide the island from public view while keeping the file open for the people who were still out there on the water. My cell phone vibrated violently in my breast pocket, the sharp electronic buzz sounding like an explosion in the quiet vault. I pulled it out with a shaking hand, my thumb tapping the glass frantically. The carrier name at the top of the screen was gone, replaced by a single line of text and network range inside. I dialed my ex-wife's number anyway, desperate for any connection to the life I had left behind 3 years ago. The line connected instantly without a single ring. The audio that came through the small speaker wasn't her voice. It wasn't a dial tone. It was the steady, rhythmic sound of a large wood fire crackling in an open space, followed by a sudden, violent hiss as a large bucket of water was dumped directly onto the coals. A loud, wet explosion of steam filled my ear, a rhythmic, suffocating shoosh pop that repeated in a perfect 3-second loop. There was no longer an outside to contact. Every wire, every signal, and every cellular frequency on my grid had been rerouted into the interior of the wet fire pit. I dropped the phone onto the concrete floor and ran for the front entrance vestibule, driven by a raw, animal instinct to get to my truck before the building filled completely with ash. I reached the double-locked doors, grabbed the heavy brass handle, and threw my weight against the timber. The latch cleared, but the door didn't move an inch. I looked through the small, wire-reinforced glass viewing window in the center of the frame. The parking lot was gone. The gravel driveway, by truck, the security lights, and the highway indicators had vanished behind a solid, opaque wall of thick, blue-black glacial ice that had sealed the station from the outside. The ice was perfectly smooth, pressing flat against the exterior glass like a frozen specimen slide, carrying within its frozen core the dark, silhouetted shapes of ancient white pines that had been dead for 10,000 years. The administrative perimeter of the park had closed around the building itself. The station had been legally and physically declared a primitive zone. No motorized vehicles, no modern infrastructure, and no egress allowed out across the boundary lines. I walked backwards slowly into the central office space, my arms hanging loose at my side. The air pressure in the room was dropping rapidly, making my ears pop with a sharp, painful click. A thick, freezing ground mist began to pour out of the ceiling vents, rolling across the linoleum floor like water. It smelled intensely of damp needles, rotting vegetation, and cold lake water. The ambient temperature in the office dropped 40 degrees in less than 30 seconds, turning my breath into thick white plumes that hung in the air like smoke. My fingers went completely numb inside my gloves, but I didn't feel the need to shake them out. My posture adjusted automatically, shifting into the long-held alignment of standard field readiness that I had practiced during my years on water patrol. In the dark corner of the main counter, a sharp metallic clack echoed through the room. It was the old battery-powered dot matrix impact printer, a legacy Panasonic unit from 1994 that we kept hooked up to a backup capacitor for emergency fire control dispatches during lightning blackouts. The machine's internal rollers began to grind, a high-pitched mechanical scream, as the metal print head jerked to the left-hand margin. With immense physical force, the pins began striking the dried ink ribbon, advancing a continuous form sheet of green bar paper through the tractor feed. Click, click, tack, cack. I walked over to the machine, my flashlight beam steady now, a cold, absolute clarity emerging from the center of my panic. I stood frozen, watching the mechanical monster generate a physical reality in the dark. The loop had reached peak pressure. It was forcing its final document into the world, and I was the only clerk left to file it. The print head completed its final pass and fell silent with a sharp ping. I leaned over the tray. The camper name, field on the green bar paper, didn't say Miller, Crane, or Gorse. Printed in sharp, modern, unmistakable block text was my own name, Vance Cordell. The designated route instructions were clear. Depart immediately via Fall Lake launch. Navigate north through border lakes. Locate wet fire pit on closed island 44, Knife Lake. Complete compliance audit. A profound, terrifying sense of peace clicked into place behind my eyes. The exhaustion of my failed personal life, the empty house, the endless repetition of the filing boxes, the long-term obsession with an order that never existed in the real world, disappeared. I understood my purpose. The system didn't care about my personal history or my identity. It only required the bureaucratic slot to be filled by someone who couldn't let a file go unresolved. I was the next scheduled compliance auditor, and the record book was waiting for my signature. I walked over to the master desk with slow, mechanical precision. I opened the canvas-bound daily station ledger, flipping to the final page for October 2026. Using my vintage Fisher Space pen, I logged my own name, badge number, departure time 4:14 a.m., and destination, permit number 314, compliance audit. I closed the heavy volume, aligning its leather edges perfectly with the corners of the green desk blotter so the room would be orderly for the next shift. I walked down into the equipment locker at the back of the hallway. I pulled my official high-visibility Forest Service flotation jacket over my shoulders, snapping the plastic buckles with a series of clean, rhythmic clicks. I grabbed my heavy aluminum compliance clipboard, clamping the wet copy of permit number 314 to the front under the steel spring. I selected my personal ashwood paddle from the rack and a single dry bag containing my emergency shelter. Every movement was calm, measured, and perfectly executed, according to the Winter Emergency Manual. I had ceased to be a man fleeing a crisis. I was a pure extension of the agency's enforcement arm, moving out to clear an infraction that had been waiting for me since 1986. I opened the lakeside utility hatch, the small, uninsulated door at the water level, used for launching the patrol canoes during the high water spring floods. The lake launch was a sheet of black glass, the freezing rain creating a thin, crackling skim of white slush along the reeds. I set the government-issued Kevlar canoe into the water. It floated silently, its green hull cutting through the gray slurry without a sound. I stepped into the center of the hull, my leather boots settling into the wet floorboards. I pushed off from the frozen stones of the shore. The dark, tannin-stained water instantly swallowed the silhouette of the canoe as I took my first deep, rhythmic paddle stroke into the freezing fog. My movement was no longer being tracked by any satellite or radar tower in the civilian world outside. I existed only on the aluminum clipboard resting across my lap. The sun rose over the pines 2 hours later, casting a cold, pale yellow light through the triple-paned windows of the Fall Lake Ranger Station. The power grid had reset, the office lights burning bright while the space heaters clicked merrily against the morning chill. At exactly 6:30 a.m., a young replacement seasonal clerk named Miller entered the front door, stamping the fresh snow off his heavy pack boots. He walked into the main office and found the space perfectly orderly, organized to the highest professional standard. On the center blotter rested Vance's pristine, completed compliance file for the fiscal year, every box checked, every signature lined up in a neat, vertical row. Miller checked a coffee pot, smiled at the neatness of the counter, and assumed Vance had simply completed his shift early and left for his scheduled winter break down south. The administrative transition had occurred without a single ripple through the staff roster. The system had seamlessly adjusted its payroll database to ensure that no flags would ever be raised regarding an unexplained absence. Miller walked over to the digital mapping terminal to run the standard morning diagnostic check before the public hours began. He woke the screen from its sleep mode. The advanced GIS mapping software refreshed, displaying the master topographical view of the Saganaga corridor. Miller zoomed in on the Knife Lake sector to verify the winter boundary lines. The new, deep, unmapped bay that had rendered itself during the night shift remained permanently fixed in the digital architecture, its black contour lines deep, sharp, and perfectly integrated into the green national park borders. Tucked inside the paper folder on the desk sat the fresh 2026 carbon slip for permit number 314, completely signed by Vance Cordell, the purple ink still wet to the touch and carrying the sharp, bitter smell of wet wood ash. Wheeler looked at the newly rendered bay on the monitor, assumed it had always been there since the original surveys were drawn, and closed the program to process the next scheduled file in his queue. The error was now part of the landscape, waiting in the dark for the next scheduled compliance audit in 10 years. Now, whenever I look at an old state road map or a printed federal survey boundary, I don't see the lines where the towns end or where the highways cross the county grid. I look at the white negative spaces between the margins, the blank, unprinted zones where the paper stays smooth and the cartographers chose to write nothing at all. I know what's sitting inside those gaps, waiting for someone to find a typo in the old files, so it can pull them out of their chair and into the ink.